All right, everyone, thank you so much for being here for our event today on the title, The Zelensky Effect, the story of Ukraine through the journey of its president. My name is Kristin Bakke. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science. I'm going to chair the event, so mainly I'm going to take all the eager questions from you at the end after our wonderful speakers have talked. We are joined by Olga Onuch and Emma Graham Harrison. I'm going to say some nice things about them in a moment, but let's sort of set the stage first. So the title of the talk today is, or the seminar discussion, is the Zelensky Effect. And since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, President Zelensky has become a hero figure really in Ukraine, but also abroad. And quite famously, Anna's pointed out on the sleeve of this book, at the beginning of the war, with the Russian shells raining on Kyiv and tanks closing in, the Americans were offering to rescue or extract Zelensky from Kyiv, and he quite famously said, "I need ammunition, not a ride." Now, the talk, or what we're going to be focusing on in the talk, what we're going to be hearing about is some of the research that Olga, Onuch, and Henry Hale have done for this book, The Zelensky Effect, and the subtitle of the book is The Zelensky Effect, the story of Ukraine through... No, there is no subtitle in the book. We just gave a subtitle to the talk. The Zelensky Effect is the title of the book. And the starting point is that it's difficult to understand the events of 2022 and the extraordinary mobilization of the Ukrainian mobilization we've seen without considering the important role played by President Zelensky. And in her remarks and in the book, Professor Onuch will talk about how this isn't just a story about, of course, President Zelensky. It's also about the story of the civic nation he embodies. What makes Zelensky most extraordinary in war is his very ordinariness as a Ukrainian. So we'll hear more about that in the remarks from Professor Onuch. Let me now introduce our two speakers and say some of the wonderful things about them. So Olga Onuch is Professor of Comparative Politics and Ukrainian Politics at the University of Manchester. She has written extensively on mobilization, protests, participation of ordinary people in politics in Ukraine and also Argentina. She has, in addition to this book, she has written a book on mapping mass mobilization, and her work has appeared in leading journals in political science, and she's also a frequent commentator on Ukrainian politics, the authority, I would say, in the UK on Ukrainian politics. We're also delighted to be joined by Emma Graham Harrison, who's a senior international affairs correspondent for The Guardian and The Observer. Emma has been covering the war in Ukraine. She has also been covering a number of other wars. She's coming recently from having been covering the war in Israel-Gaza. Prior to that, she's been covering the American invasion of Iraq, the Syria civil war, the coup in Zimbabwe that overthrew Robert Mugabe, so an extensive record of covering violence and wars. And she's won multiple awards for her journalism and both the reporting and investigating journalism. For example, she was named the Foreign Correspondent of the Year in 2018 by the National Press Awards. So we have two amazing speakers, and we are very privileged to be learning from their insights today. So the idea is that Olga is going to start talking about the book, then Emma is going to be reflecting on the book and the role of President Zelensky and mobilization in Ukraine based on her work in Ukraine. Then I will have a question or two, unless you look super eager, and then we take questions from all of you. So that's the plan.
Fantastic.
Please,
okay.
Olga, go ahead.
Right. And how does super eager look like? Just so you know how to look.
Yeah, like...
all right. Thank you so much. I don't know if I'm the authority, but I'm one of, and I'm also on a panel with someone that I admire, and it's a thrill. And it's lovely to see so many of you here. How many, who are students? Awesome. Oh, I got so happy. Unfortunately, today I only have 3 copies to give to students. I always give out copies to students when I present. So it will go to the first 3 who ask a question. So Put those hands up fast is the only thing I can do. Yeah, you have to wait. Okay, all right. So let's get to this. First, I'm going to read you a little bit of a scene. Normally, I have a picture of Zelensky standing in his green jumper, but you all know the image. Fearless, earnest, Russian target number one, the man in the green t-shirt or jumper, as you may have seen him. As Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine unfolds in real time across screens worldwide, across your very screens, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has captured the global imagination like no one else. Although we might discuss a little bit further whose imagination around the globe. Just 3 years ago, Zelensky was still just a television star, whose main qualifications for Ukraine's presidency, it seemed, was having played one on TV. The Kremlin obviously saw him as a pushover, but not only the Kremlin. Folks in London, folks in DC, folks in Brussels, certainly a lot of folks in Moscow, folks in Warsaw, perhaps folks in Buenos Aires as well. Rarely has a politician so visibly surprised so many. The man Ukrainians, some affectionately, some not so affectionately, call Ze, has come to symbolize the nation's fierce resistance to what many experts initially thought was a military juggernaut for Russia. Yet, this full-on Ukrainian mobilization by ordinary Ukrainians and Zelensky's potential to rally it should have been no surprise, at least for those of us who've been studying this for quite some time, and for Ukrainians themselves, it was not one. The reason for its success is not that Zelensky has some special leadership traits that set him apart from his country. Instead, what makes him extraordinary in war comes very much from, as Kristen already said, from his ordinariness as a Ukrainian. He inherits a tradition of dissent, and he also inherits a fierce civic sense that is baked into the country's identity prior to much of the world starting to pay attention to that country. So, he is the Ukrainian every person, albeit in a way that very few could be. So now let's get to this. Why did Zelensky act so bravely? He did not take the Americans' ride, as it were, because he knew some things about the people in his country. First off, he understood that the dominant identity for the broad majority of Ukrainian citizens was one that was a civic identity, a fierce attachment to the state, not to ethno-linguistic identities per se. And in fact, that was not a new development. Much of the data is presented in our book. Not a new development, not a post-2019 development, not a post-2022 development. This is something that has been happening in Ukraine since the early 1990s. In fact, in the first decade of Ukraine's independence, we saw people re-identifying themselves as Ukrainians. We started studying, why is this happening? What is happening? Are they suddenly not they were of Russian descent before and now they're not? No, we started to understand that what people were reporting to us was about civic identity, attachment to the Ukrainian state, regardless of their ethnic descent or the language that they practiced. He also knew some other very interesting things. He knew that, in fact, it was in those first 5 years of independence, it was in large Russian-speaking urban centers where the broad majority of people would do this re-identification. He also knew that this was not a new post-independence phenomenon, and that dissidents in Ukraine for the decades prior came from across the whole of Ukraine. In fact, some of the most famous dissidents came from the East and South, perhaps not as well known to the median citizen, but nonetheless an important fact. In the days prior to February 24th, on the eve of all-out invasion, Ivan Zuba, a Ukrainian dissident, passes away. Zelensky takes a pause in his speech at a time where most understand that an invasion is imminent. He takes a pause in his speech to reflect on the life of Ivan Dzyuba. He does this tactically. He is doing it to remind Ukrainians of very important things. Ivan Dzyuba is from Donetsk. He was a Russian speaker until his 20s. He wrote one of the most famous treaties against Russian chauvinism. He was also a communist. He believed so much that a well-reasoned argument can make an impact on people, that he hand-delivered that treatise to the Communist Party headquarters. Every time I say that, I get a shiver, because he was a hopeful man. Obviously, that's his life story is not. He's sentenced to prison. Talking about him on the eve of all-out invasion, reminding maybe a younger generation that might not know him very well, is exactly what Zelensky's focusing on. Civic identity, regardless of the language you speak. He also knows some other things. He knows that the independence generation, not only does he know that there were many moments of mass mobilization, he knows that the independence generation, people like him, people like me in their 40s, who were between the ages of 7 and 14 at the time of independence, have a living memory, both of the Soviet Union, of that euphoria of independence, and then of the massive disappointment that comes thereafter in the 1990s, that period of the wild, wild East. And they do not benefit from that period. They do not become wealthy from that period. It is a different generation that benefits from that wild, wild East 1990s. It is the generation of Petro Poroshenko and many other oligarchs who come to rule and dominate politics in the country for a very long time. And he knows about these more moments of euphoria, of rise of mass mobilization of ordinary citizens, and then of massive disappointment thereafter. The Orange Revolution, the Euromaidan. Actually, in 2015, Ukraine saw some of the worst poverty rates in its history. Euphoria and disappointment, euphoria and disaffection. And even though after the Euromaidan, the independence generation started to take a stronger hold in politics, and the Euro-optimists like Svetlana Zalishchuk and Nayem and Leshchenko did make their way into politics, they were still not able to lead anything. They were almost there, co-opted for their engagement before. So he knows all these things. How do we know he knows all these things? Because he's been telling us for years. We did a discourse and content analysis of all of his presidential speeches. We did a discourse and content analysis of all of his campaign material. We did a discourse and content analysis of the entire Servant of the People show. And we also painstakingly did this for multiple theatrical performances over the years. He's been saying this stuff all along. And so it wasn't a surprise to him that ordinary Ukrainians would stop tanks with their bare hands, that they went in Russophone parts of the country, they were speaking in Russian. This did not surprise him at all because he is exactly from those same parts of the nation. And he himself was a Russophone for so many years. What in fact we saw between 2019 and 2022, we saw the Ukrainization of Vladimir Zelensky. When he announces his candidacy, he says, "I'm Vladimir Zelensky." And then he switches into Ukrainian. And that's one of the last times that he calls himself that publicly in a speech, unless he's trying to speak directly to citizens of Russia. So what happens thereafter? We know that 80% of the civilian population of Ukraine are engaged in the war effort in some shape or form. We collect this data with surveys throughout the early months of the all-out invasion by Russia. We know that people are telling us that they volunteer, that they give money, that they might engage in protest, that they might actually enlist in the army or in the territorial defense. But those of us who've been conducting survey research, not only in Ukraine, but around the world for many, many, many years, what surprised Henry and me most was a multiple choice question with those very options that I just told you. And then you always give this other option. People might tell you something else. In May 2022, we got hundreds of other answers of ordinary citizens' engagement in the war effort. I'm not being dramatic. A person in the Southeast that is an elderly, and can you imagine, this is over the telephone, you're being interviewed in a survey, and they are, write this down. Mark my personal engagement in the war effort as follows. I cooked, and in Ukrainian it's sitny ukrainsky soup, a hearty Ukrainian soup, and I walked it over to the forest. I dug up potatoes. I milked the goatlings, because apparently, I didn't know this, but the protein in goatling milk is particularly good, and our boys and girls at the front need that. Of course, other things. I made camouflage nets, and somebody told us they did all sorts of other things that need not mention here, but nonetheless, write it down. Those are the real brave acts. Zelensky knew that this is the people he is dealing with because he was one of them. That's the thing. He is the product of the civic nation in the history. It is the Ukrainian civic nation that makes him and that gives him strength to then be the leader that we come to see in 2022 and thereforward. But at the same time, that's just one side of the coin. One side of the Zelensky Effect coin. The other side of the Zelensky Effect coin is the very real and direct effect that he has on a very particular constituency in the country. Because he is like them, and because he embodies the civic identity during his presidency. Those in the Southeast, those who are Russophone, those who are Russian ethnic, who for 30 years may not have thought that democracy is the best system for Ukraine, having voted for Zelensky or his party in 2019, over the years in our panel surveys that follow people over time, moved to supporting democracy. These are people that found it hard to say if democracy is good after 30 years. Having voted for Zelensky, they start moving to a pro-democracy position. They also start moving to a pro-EU position. They also start moving to a pro-NATO position. It is him and his discourse that keeps saying it doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter what your descent is. As a citizen of Ukraine, you have a duty to defend the state and its democracy. And he brings them along with him. And it is these people that are the front line in February 2022. And it is these people that say, "Ya Ruski," I'm Russian ethnically, but I'm a Ukrainian citizen. And we have those on videos by journalists who are on the ground. So there's other problems, obviously, with Zelensky and the folks that are in his cabinet. Don't have time to go into that right now. But his ability to speak to a certain constituency of his own citizens, I think, is the most important thing he has done to date. Others might think it is his leadership during war. I think if it wasn't his leadership prior to the all-out invasion of Ukraine, then we may have seen some different dynamics play out. That's where I'm going to end it, maybe.
So is that Working, yeah. First of all, I should say I'm honoured to be here and feel very much an amateur. I'm one of the people who didn't know very much about Ukraine, didn't understand Ukraine very much. My background is Chinese studies. I did a degree in Chinese studies. I'm a Mandarin speaker. I lived there for a long time. Because of my experience covering conflicts, when it looked like there was going to be a full-scale war in Ukraine, I flew to Kyiv, which was the 15th of February, 2022. For those who don't know, the war started on the 24th. So I was there more or less full-time for a couple of months, but I'm here very much as an amateur. So I'm waiting to be corrected. And what I can really bring is kind of impressions of, you know, what I've seen on the ground over the last sort of nearly 2 years now, and the perspective from other places I go. I mean, I thought I've just actually come back from being in Jerusalem, the West Bank, covering obviously not Gaza because you can't get there. And I thought one of the things that maybe I'd just touch on very briefly, you know, you've talked about sort of his internal constituency and how Zelensky is seen inside Ukraine. And I think one of the biggest challenges for Ukraine at the moment is how the conflict is perceived externally. You know, the legacy of the Cold War era, a time when obviously, you know, Russia was enthusiastically pursuing its own imperial project within the boundaries of the USSR, but was equally enthusiastically, as probably all of you students at UCL know, supporting, you know, anti-colonial liberation movements around the world in very substantial and important ways with, you know, money, weapons, training. And the legacy of that means, you know, and to me, when I travel, particularly outside Europe, it's very strong to see, complicated, I would say, by the terrible legacy of the West's invasion, or the US, UK, Spain's invasion of Iraq in 2001. What is seen very clearly in Europe, in America, as a war for democracy, the way it's, you know, seen in Ukraine, the way I would see it for sort of liberal progressive values, and crucially an anti-imperial struggle, is very much not seen that way in a lot of the rest of the world. There's a lot of sympathy for Moscow. There's not just the impact of, you know, propaganda like Russia Today and Sputnik, but there's the legacy of all these years of you know, political alliances. And, you know, people often say, well, you know, the last time the West said it was supporting democracy in a big war, that was in Iraq, and look how that worked out. Sorry, 2003, not 2001. I'm confusing Afghanistan and Iraq in my mind. And I think that's going to be a particularly big challenge, you know, watching sort of Russia and China come out very strongly criticising Israel, which obviously, you know, I don't think there's going to be people here who think that civilians should be indiscriminately bombed, but someone like Russia, you know, Putin, who is behind the massacre of civilians in Syria, an indiscriminate bombing campaign, for someone like that to come out as a critic of bombing civilians and have credibility should be surprising. But what's happening, I think, is it's solidifying these divisions between people who see Ukraine's struggle as a anti-imperialist struggle and people who buy into the argument you're coming from Moscow that this is a war provoked by NATO, that this is essentially, you know, a war between NATO and Russia. And I think it's interesting if you look, for instance, at Zelensky's choice of defense minister. You know, he's just appointed a Crimean Tatar, a Muslim, as his defense minister. And one of the strongest, or one of the arguments that Russia makes that I think has the biggest foothold in places that are perhaps supportive of Ukraine broadly is this idea, Krim Nash, Crimea is ours. That the rest of Ukraine, you know, you see people like, I don't know, Elon Musk saying, yeah, we should make a peace deal where Russia gets to keep Crimea, which is essentially endorsing ethnic cleansing, of course, because the idea that Crimea is Russian is predicated on the mass deportation and slaughter of Crimean Tatars, the geographic renaming of Crimea. But I think having someone who is ethnic Crimean Tatar from Crimea, who's part of that community, it's much harder to say to someone like that, well, Crimea is Russian. And so I think, you know, it's interesting, this year for the first time, Zelensky attended an iftar with, you know, it's the first time that he'd sort of publicly gone to an iftar, again, with the Crimean Tatar community. I think there's an awareness, perhaps, and you know, Olga can talk about this more, of the need to try and change the way that this conflict is seen in the global south, you know, particularly for things like, obviously that's not so much where weapons are coming from, but, you know, the way things are discussed at the UN and internationally. So I think, I guess that would be my perspective, that there's this kind of quite interesting international debate going on, you know, and I think Zelensky's definitely trying to address it, but it's hard to talk about, you know, I think it's treacherous ground for Zelensky, because if you start talking about the history of anti-imperial struggle, anti-colonial struggle against Western powers, then you're getting into the struggle against the people who are now supporting, you know, Zelensky and giving him money. And I think it's, I just add one last thing, people like, say, Boris Johnson, who like going to Kyiv, particularly when they've got problems at home, I would say they would not see that, or they wouldn't cast it as an anti-colonial or an anti-imperial struggle. They would cast it as a fight for liberal democracy. And I actually think you could say that's just gradations, but I think that's quite a big difference, because it enables people like Johnson, who would come out and say, you know, the empire was great, or I might be quoting him slightly wrong, but it's definitely, I'd say, has said, you know, there's good things about the empire or whatever, to, yeah, to not need to have any critical look at our own colonial history and our own imperial history and how that sort of affects things, and yet go and be part of, you know, enthusiastically part of this anti-imperial struggle. And last time I was in Kyiv, about 2 weeks ago, so I did a sort of turnaround. I was in Ukraine and then had to go to Jerusalem. There was, I was having a chat with some young progressive Ukrainians, and we were talking about Boris Johnson and the great love for him in Ukraine, which is quite extraordinary. I said, well, you know, a lot of his views, particularly about imperialism, they're quite, you know, they might not go down that well. And I had the exact quote then, because I'd sort of looked it up. And they said, I can't believe he said that. I can't believe he said that. And they went and looked it up and were sort of like, oh, OK, that's not great. So maybe we understand, you know, where you're coming from. So, yeah, I guess that would just be one perspective that I think I could bring. And a couple of questions I would be very interested to hear that are addressed in the book, and I don't know if they'll come up later, but we're possibly going to talk about elections, whether they can be held. I think that's very interesting. The general view of people when I was last there was that they shouldn't be held, that it would involve disenfranchising people in occupied territories, that it would involve too much money, because obviously people in occupied territories couldn't vote at a time when the national economy should be focused on the war, but I'd be interested to hear what you think. And then you touch very briefly at the end of the book about what happens after the war. Since I've been going back over the last year, I'd say the people who you write about who fell in behind Zelensky, wouldn't have voted for him, didn't support him, still very much support him as a wartime president, but I'd say they're thinking more about what comes next. They probably a minority, but it's sort of interesting, you know, can he lead the war and carry on after? And particularly if he has to make some kind of concessions to reach a peace deal, if Ukraine can't pull off an overwhelming military victory, what does that mean for Zelensky and for this cycle you were talking about of, you know, civic belief, euphoria that you had in 2014, and then the disappointment that you can push for change and you can get rid of a leader, but that doesn't mean you've changed a whole society. You know, what comes after the war? So I think those are some of the things that I would find interesting to hear from Olga rather than getting my perspective on.
Thank you. So I'm going to, seeing that we have a professional journalist on the panel, I'm going to, of course, pick up on her question, because she, you know, this is what she does. She asks brilliant questions. So let's perhaps begin with the question of elections and the prospects of election. And there's been a debate about holding elections. Should elections be held? When should they be held? Can they be held? And I would love to hear Olga's take. I would also like to hear Emma's take, having been on the ground. And I think related to that is the question of what are the prospects? So if there is an election, I mean, my bet would be on, you know, Zelensky winning. But you know, I would be curious to hear your views on that. So maybe we begin there.
Well, Emma, what do you think? Will there be an election?
I'm not qualified to say, but from what people have told me, I would say no. I think logistically, and I think the point about disenfranchising the people of the occupied territories is particularly important. I think it comes back to what you were saying about this civic identity, in the sense we're all Ukrainian. In a way, people who are under occupation, even more so because of what they're enduring for the idea of being Ukrainian.
I'm just making sure that I'm being recorded correctly. Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it's even more beyond simply logistic or disenfranchising voters, all very important things. Currently, legally, that wouldn't be allowed. You would have to make legal changes that would allow to hold a wartime election. So for those people who were talking about rumors and whispers in Kyiv over the summer that election might be held in fall, really just shows you that either they were doing that on purpose as a tactic, or they don't know what they're talking about, because the law would take at least 1 or 2 months to change. Then things would have to start getting in preparation. So we would see a lead-in into an election that would be maybe 2 to 3 months in, right? At the very least. And we're just not there. We're not there for a March election or an April election. It's just not going to happen anytime soon. It's not that it is impossible to hold an election. It's that we will see a lead-in very clearly when it starts happening, if it starts happening. There are other tools, though, that can be used. So I know that colleagues in DC, colleagues in Kyiv are talking about the capacity to do e-voting and other things. There's a lot of very smart people trying to work on this. But lead-in would be several months. I personally, though, think you should not hold an election during wartime. Not simply because of the logistics or that you may disenfranchise voters. Again, incredibly important things. I do not think, for the sake of civic unity, it is a good idea to hold an election. For those of you who may have taken a politics course and read Linz's Perils of Presidentialism, an epic little article, it is a divide and rule election, right? You have to draw boundary lines, not only between the candidates, but between the citizens, the supporters of one or the other or the third. And why on earth would politicians in Ukraine want to do that right now? And quite frankly, this is why civil society organizations are also not necessarily in favor of holding an election right now. It's possible to do. It can happen. And if it were to happen this year, Zelensky wins. Probably as the way he did in 2019, to be perfectly honest. And we have done this. We have done so many different, I know you do questions of this nature. We've done this in experimental fashion, trying to really get out. No one will come even close at this point. Anything can happen. You know, in 6 months, a lot can change. But consistently over the course of the last nearly now 2 years, we see no movement on this. There is a core group. We talk about them in the book, the 25%ers. They are still there. Those are the people, that's how oftentimes colloquially people who voted for Poroshenko are referred to. This is a lost constituency in Ukraine, quite frankly. Many of them were sold the story of Russian revanchism in 2019. They haven't really rebounded and reconfigured since that. There's a lot of, I think, work that the opposition has to do with them. They are the same. They wouldn't vote for Zelensky. Nothing's changed. Publicly, they show support for Zelensky. Privately, they wouldn't vote for him. So we pretty much get a result just like 2019.
And I just have one more thing that, again, but people pointed out to me, they said, look, we've already got a government of national unity anyway. It's not like Zelensky's there and there's other people, you know, everybody's in it together. The opposition are in government with him anyway. And, you know, that's quite a strong argument. They're all working together. So no, to not have another, if they're all in government together and they're all okay with that, then let's carry on fighting.
Thank you. I think I'm going to save my questions and then open it up to you. Okay, someone's very eager here. So why don't you start, then we go to you. And so the rest of you, I know you're over here, so why don't you start? Say your name, perhaps, or where you're from, and then your question.
Just hold the mic, just like kind of here, you know, to hold it really close to your chair.
Brilliant, thank you. So my name's Henry Pryor. I'm studying here at UCL, and perhaps a question predominantly for Emma here, but I wonder what are the parallels between Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the increasingly confrontational rhetoric between China and Taiwan? if any?
Yeah, I mean, no, I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of parallels. You know, they're small democracies. They're almost the same age. You know, Taiwan's first presidential election was 1996. I mean, in terms of their democracy, they both had a long and difficult struggle, actually, for democracy. You know, Taiwan was a dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek. They had their martyrs, their dissidents, you know, who paid, some of them with their lives, a lot of other very heavy prices. They even have other similarities, nothing to do with politics, both obsessed with good coffee. I don't know if people have been to Ukraine or Taiwan. Both some of the places with the best coffee and the best cocktails in the world. There's a lot of sympathy in Taiwan for Ukraine. I was there over the summer. There's people who are doing civil defense training because they say what's happening to Ukraine is going to happen to us. I think the Chinese leadership has made a little secret of the fact that, you know, Xi Jinping, that he would like to you know, take over Taiwan. I think there's very interesting issues around language that are very similar as well. Sort of whether you have Mandarin or whether you speak Taiyu, you know, and culturally, the whole issue of being within, you know, China's cultural sphere, or whether you have your own Taiwanese cultural sphere. It's hard officially for Ukraine to have much solidarity with Taiwan because obviously they're trying to keep China as neutral as possible. Well, it's not really neutral, but, you know, at least limit how much. But broadly, I found in Taiwan people were very understanding and sympathetic of that. So yes, I think, you know, it's another instance where you could. There's also historical things, you know, Beijing claiming Taiwan as rightfully part of China, when the history is very complicated. You know, Taiwan has not been ruled from Beijing. At least, you know, it was a Japanese colony before it was taken over by the nationalists. So that's a very long history of not being ruled by Beijing. And, you know, you can go back beyond that. So I think it's, you know, yes, people in Taiwan are watching very closely, and particularly, you know, America already engaged financially, militarily with Ukraine. You know, now everything that's happening with Gaza and Israel, there's certainly, you know, there's no question that China is watching what's happening, what's playing out in Ukraine for many reasons, yeah. I don't know if you'd have...
I have nothing to add there. That was brilliant.
That was amazing. Thank you. Yes. I didn't know all these similarities.
Just speak here. Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Freya. I'm a PhD student at UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and I really like that you talked about change and continuity as a trend. And I see a lot in scholarship on Ukrainian politics and society this use of February 24th as an analytical tool, talking about more and more research of pre-full-scale invasion trends and post-full-scale invasion trends as pre and post. And I'm wondering if you think that this is a useful lens to analyze Ukrainian politics and society, and whether you think it's a useful lens to look at Zelensky's leadership, if we can actually talk about a pre-war Zelensky's leadership, wartime, and maybe even a post-war one day, hopefully, when Ukrainian victory comes. Thanks.
Yes, not if, when. It's an excellent question. And I think as scholars, we often look to critical junctures as potential moments in time that might change the scope and shape of events thereafter, of the actors at play and how they behave. And certainly there is a critical juncture, February 24th, even though the war began in 2014, clearly February 24th is a critical juncture in this sense. But to answer your question, and I don't know if it's a useful analytical tool, it depends, I think, on what you are studying and in what way. And certainly we know that there are rally effects following. So, for instance, if the rally to democracy only occurred following February 24th, 2022, and we didn't see that upward continuous trend prior, then we would say it's a rally effect. How long can it be sustained? What are the roots of supporting it, right? But when we know that things precede in a certain fashion, then we can make other claims, right? We still don't know how much of that rally effect is sustained, but we do know that it's the same types of people that are rallying that started to rally earlier, right? And that's very important. So it depends on what you're studying. When it comes to Zelensky, that's one of the things we say in the book. No, he's not a new Zelensky. Just because some people started to pay attention to what he has to say doesn't mean that he wasn't saying it all along. We do it in a variety of ways, actual text, actual words. There's sentences that he used previously that he then uses in the all-out war context. but also the green t-shirt. It's not a new thing. Every time he was doing anything related to the war prior, or obviously not meeting in Paris, but when he was traveling to Donetsk, Luhansk, when he was talking to military folks, when he also wore these outfits. And he also did self-recorded videos. In fact, he used to wear a turtleneck, a black turtleneck much more often. It wasn't a very good look, though. But that was his cash. Now I guess, so when he was, to speak to the people kind of thing, which is obviously these tactical things, they're not new. And the words are not new, and the content is not new, the substance is not new. Just there is newness in who started paying attention. And amongst the 25%ers, what is interesting is that exactly this, who starts paying attention to his messaging and how. And the 25%ers specifically, when we're doing some research, find it hard to acknowledge that this isn't new. Because they are very fine and comfortable with saying, okay, he stepped into the role because of the critical juncture. But they're not comfortable saying that he was like this all along, because that means, of course, that they miscalculated, that they misunderstood. And that's psychologically very difficult and actually can be very painful for a voter. So it depends what you're studying is the academic answer. And no, he's not doing anything that new.
Okay, great. We had hands over here, yes?
Yeah. Firstly, thanks very much for paneling the talk tonight. I'm George, a politics student at King's College, and as intricate, complex, and multi-dimensional as the question is, what do you think, and there's probably no short answer for this, but what do you think is the most likely outcome for Russia's invasion to cease, given that we have another conflict in Israel, Gaza? The West is funding both conflicts, and I think it's fair to say that both can't periodically continue.
Thank you.
Emma, do you want to start off?
Okay, I'd say very briefly, not last time I was in Ukraine, the time before, in August, when I was in Ukraine, I interviewed the general who is leading the southern offensive, who they just had a breakthrough. He's sort of there's Zaluzhny, who's the chief, and there's two under him, and Tarnavsky's one of them. They'd just broken through the Russian defensive lines at huge cost, very slow progress, remained slow. And I sort of asked him basically a similar question. At some point, does Ukraine have to accept a partial deal? And he said something which I hear a lot. I'd be interested to see if you think it's an accurate reflection overall or just a journalist anecdote. He said, look, we have to keep on fighting because our grandparents fought, our parents fought, and if we don't fight, if we don't win this, this is going to be our children's battle and our grandchildren's battle. He was talking about the Holodomor. I don't know if people know about that, but I don't know quite how specialised people are here, but the mass starvation, imposed on Ukraine, the dissidents who were killed. And I feel even people who aren't happy with how the war is going, people very much feel that this is the definitive struggle. They look at what happened in 2014, the Minsk Accords. They say if we let Russia keep a foothold, they are just going to use it to take breathing space and come back and go for Kyiv again. And we have to inflict a humiliating defeat. Of course, that doesn't mean that Ukraine necessarily can, but I think you have to separate out Western appetite for funding and the capacity for providing weapons from Ukrainian desire to fight. And yes, America, the UK might be distracted, they might have less money, but and there is, certainly Ukraine wouldn't have got to this point without Western weaponry, but it has also, it got to each time it's had a military success, people didn't think that Ukraine could keep Kyiv. They were preparing for a guerrilla war in the West. Once Kyiv had been liberated, then people thought that would sort of be it, maybe. And then swathes of Kharkiv were liberated. Each time people thought that Crimea was indefensible. There's been invulnerable,
Impenetrable.
Impenetrable, yes. And And, you know, you've seen these incredibly daring sort of commando drone raids, which have forced Russia to move a large part of its, you know, not only has the Moskva been sunk and all these other things, they've been forced to move a big part of their Black Sea fleet away from Sevastopol. And so I think, you know, and a lot of that has been achieved with their own, you know, Ukrainians' drones. Yes, commandos trained in the UK and other places, but I don't think you should underestimate Ukraine's desire to fight, and also the fact that they, you know, part of, I would say, Zelensky's genius is, you sort of talk about in the book, the fact that he doesn't really try to get that involved in military stuff. He's like, you guys, generals, you know how to fight. I essentially know how to do PR. And he's constantly trying to shore up support, bolster support, you know, and the people who are giving Ukraine money and weapons. So I think at this point it's quite hard. I wouldn't say necessarily that, yes, there are issues with ongoing support, but I wouldn't sort of say that it's kind of falling off a cliff, or that Ukraine can't fight without a diminished level. Yes, they need some Western funding, but...
So we're not really good getting into debates, because we seem to agree on a lot of things. But I can debate if, you know, just to be devil's advocate. No. I agree with you fully. I think there's some things that I'd like to just place a highlight on. We didn't write this book because... We didn't write this book because we thought it was sexy to write a book like this in 2022 and some weird, you know. We were doing research about what was happening during President Zelensky's presidency for several years, presenting it in boring academic conferences and writing slow papers. But we saw this thing happening for quite some time. And this thing was this civic duty, doubling down on democracy, civic national attachment. And so when I do speak with folks that know much more than I ever could possibly know about anything to do with military tactics, one of the things specifically in the UK or in the US or France or elsewhere is understanding fundamentally the ordinary Ukrainian citizens that make up the army today. They will not simply stop fighting. This is not how that war ends. If a negotiation on territorial concession is made, which I highly, highly doubt at this point, the appointment of the defense minister was a very clear signal that no, even Crimea will not be negotiated away. Any territorial concession would result in partisan warfare and would further destabilize the war itself, and nobody in the region wants that, right? So this is not a war that ends with a territorial concession. And I'm not saying that because I'm Ukrainian and I'd like to fiercely believe these things. It's because literally this is what they are doing. This is what they have been telling us, and it is above everything their attachment to the state. They are also ready, willing, and able to protest against their own government. At the time of writing the book, it was like 50-something%. We're now in the 60-something% of ordinary citizens ready, willing, and able to protest against the government, rise up against the government, if necessary. Okay? Zelensky and the generals know that this is the civilian population, because this civilian/army population is very mixed. Everyone has a friend or family member that's fighting in the war or knows of someone. So these are not people that are going to give up this territory, specifically people from the southeast themselves, who make up a very large portion of the military itself. So that's one thing. Ordinary Ukrainians will continue to fight. There are other things you can negotiate on, such as the amount of money that Russia has to pay in what's the word?
Reparations.
Reparations. Thank you. We're helping each other.
I know.
Women helping women. In reparations. There are other things that you can negotiate on. And in fact, those are the things that are being discussed at different places and different tables. But territorial concession is not going to end the war. And it will be a very, very, very long, very messy, very bloody war that will continue for generations after maybe a very short period of freezing. And that's pretty much agreement if you talk to military brass, whether they be in Ukraine or whether they actually be within the Russian army, quite frankly. There are people that get intelligence from or have interlocutors from across the border, as it were. And this is an understanding that this is not a war that ends on the signing of a territorial agreement. So it can end, but not with a territorial concession.
Could I just have one other thing into that in terms of it being a long, brutal war? This summer I was meeting some Ukrainian writers, and one of them was a poet who was reading books about the First World War, and I said, oh, why are you reading that in particular? And he said, well, we're already, there was a slight euphoria when we liberated Kyiv. There was, the first Independence Day, which was in August, right? I'm getting
August 24th.
Yeah. We were at war. It was difficult. People were dying, but there was this sense of euphoria. Now we're a year on. We all have suffered losses of people who are very close to us or close to us. The trauma is sort of societal, and we, echoing what you were saying, we feel like we're only at the beginning, maybe the end of the beginning. It's going to get worse. We're all going to lose more people, and I want to know what that level of loss does to a society, and I want to read about the Great War because that's where we're headed. I mean, not in terms of its political outcomes, but in terms of that understanding or that compact that we have to, as a nation, suffer a great deal to continue with this war. And I just thought it was very, moving and shocking, and that was, sort of saying we're this far in, the losses are terrible and they're going to get worse, and we know that, but we have to carry on.
So if I may just add something to that. So there are psychologists that have done extensive studies about PTSD in Ukraine. And the estimates, I'm not going to get the numbers right now, but it's close to 60% in the civilian population, and it's around 30-something% in the military population. There's various hypotheses and potential explanations for why that is the case. But we are dealing with an extremely traumatized civilian population. And those things also are connected to how then the civilians perceive the war. Also the perception that also the willingness to engage in certain acts of violence, desperate violence, yeah? So I think that's also something very important to understand. We need not look around too far around the world for exactly those sorts of situations. And that adds to the calculus of how a war would go on. And this is also part of the reason why a presidential election that polarizes a society that is highly traumatized would not be a particularly good thing if you are in fact interested in a healthy democracy within a country.
Thank you. There was a question further up here. I'm not sure who was first, but we just to go there and then up there, and then we go over here again.
Green jumper?
Yeah, green jumper, blue jumper, then turquoise and pink jumper. Yeah.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for holding this talk. My name is Nick, I'm a master's student here at UCL, and I'm Ukrainian myself, so it was quite emotional listening to your speech during the first 10-20 minutes. But turning to my question now, I would like to be a bit critical here, and I would like to ask you in what ways you think Zelensky's state policy could have been better since the war started, and I'm particularly hinting at his handling of corruption problems during the wartime. Do you think, is it possible to tackle this pervasiveness corruption problem in today's Ukraine, and if so, then how? Thank you so much.
Do you both want to tackle
you
this
go
question?
first, because you know more.
I don't know if that's true, but we talk about all the various things you can critique Zelensky about in the book. We just don't make it the focal point because we think, and there's a reason why I decided to write this book with Henry, somebody I've been working with for a long time, is because I didn't want any kind of my own Ukrainian biases to cloud my analysis of this, right? One way or the other. I come from a family of the 25%ers. My friends and family are the 25%ers, and I wrote this book, okay? And so all the little bits of criticism, both within the early team, we think his approach to the war initially and perceptions of possible negotiations with Putin were naive. We talk about issues around corruption that are not central just to his presidency, but obviously, I mean, the previous president was an oligarch that became very, very wealthy because of everything that happened in the country. All that is in there. We're also very worried about what happens when somebody is so popular and seemingly unquestionably so in a highly traumatized society and what that can do and the centralization that is necessary during wartime, what happens to that thereafter. So we talk about all those criticisms. In terms of what else he could have done, but when you do the calculus, I think he's done more good than bad. And I'm not the only one. Henry, the more even keel of the two of us, also thinks so. But I also think there are many mistakes during wartime. The key things that are not mistakes, though, is not intervening with the military, is when there are scandals, actually the capacity to deal with them. It's been really interesting to watch the former defense minister's position became untenable, not because of his own involvement in some procurement, corruption, and scandals, but because of procurement and corruption scandals within the ministry throughout, okay? And the fact that in the middle of a war, you can actually have a smooth transition when a minister's position becomes untenable, when that minister is the Minister of Defense, and then that minister can be involved in that transition, that's remarkable. You try to find that in many other examples. It wasn't a day-to-day thing, it was a weeks and months thing, right? We heard about it, not when it started actually happening. That's really wild, and that's really well managed. So one of the things, you know, he's good at PR, he's good at communicating, Zelensky. He's really good at managing. And what is interesting is in 2019, there was a lot of good people that were approached to head up ministries, to do things that said, no way am I going to work with Zelensky, right? They declined repeatedly. And these people are now coming into the fold and taking up ministerial posts, taking up deputy ministerial posts. And that's, I think, also a positive thing that he's able to bring in people from opposition networks and tusovki, as we, you know, cliques and clans. And that's really interesting. Many things you can critique about the war, many, but we don't have that much time here.
Emma, did you want to?
So just very briefly, I sort of would agree with all that, really. I mean, one of the things I found interesting is that clearly Zelensky came to power in a very corrupt country. You know, people saying they want to get rid of corruption doesn't equal it being got rid of. A lot of the people I've met were people who were anti-corruption activists before the war, and everything you've said about the fact that people are still being removed, yes, corruption continues. You know, wars anywhere are breeding grounds for corruption, profiteering. They always have been, they always will be. In a way, it's harder to control corruption during a war because you have the urgent necessity of getting weapons, getting stuff. People are busy, people are tired, you know, even more so than at normal times. And I'd just say I have found it quite encouraging. This is, again, my perspective is usually anecdotal, that there still seems to be a lot of space in Ukraine for protest, for opposition. Last time I was in Kyiv, I did a story about activists who are campaigning to stop the demolition of historic bits of Kyiv by what they call the construction mafia. I mean, there's extraordinary stories of basically, you know, one morning this summer, the air raid alarms went off at 4, curfew ends at 5, residents heard crashing in their neighbourhood in Podil, this beautiful historic bit of downtown Kyiv. They thought something had landed, some debris, but they didn't hear an explosion. They thought maybe something had been intercepted. They went out, there was a bulldozer knocking down a historic house. The house is still gone, but they had a protest. I did an article about it. I spoke to lots of people. You know, there's room to be, you know, a dissenter. Whereas, and I mean, there may be arrests on free speech grounds that I don't know about. But, you know, I contrast that with one of my colleagues in Israel. That's what I was just looking up in case you were wondering why I was on the phone. Did a really interesting story about suppression of dissent there since the war began, which included two, let me just, because it's not my reporting, so two activists from Jewish Arab peace movement were detained for putting up posters with a message that the police deemed offensive, and the message was, Jews and Arabs will get through this together. So if you compare, tolerance for criticism, only anecdotally, I have seen more willingness from the current government in Ukraine to have a level of public criticism, of someone like Klitschko, who's very powerful. So that seems to me a positive, along with the fact that people are being removed for corruption, that articles are being written about it, that despite having the marathon on TV, you still have a lot of web and newspaper outlets that are bringing these things out, and then things are being done about them. That seems to me positive in the context of the fact that this is still a very big problem and will definitely not go away during the war. Nobody make any bones. There will be lots of corruption in the war, lots of fortunes made, lots of dodgy things done, not specific to Ukraine, every war.
Thank you. Blue jumper. Or blue jacket, sorry.
Blazer?
Blazer.
Blazer. You. Yes, you. Yes.
Hi everyone. I'm studying in King's College in Bournemouth, and I would like to ask you one question. It's been reported that Russia is closer to revolution now more than ever. I think it was reported by Washington Post, and considering that in Russia there's a lot of guerrilla forces such as Free Russia, and considering the fact that once in 2015 Budanov, the head of counterintelligence, was once in Crimea, so what could it lead to? Another Euromaidan or civil war? Or considering that Russia has now a lot of military personnel, could it lead to bigger consequences, more than Euromaidan or just a civil war? So what do you think?
So that takes us to Russian politics.
Not an easy question to answer, and I'm going to bring in Mark Basinger. Just a few weeks ago, said the following. He thinks it's highly unlikely, but not impossible, that a revolution happens in Russia. The problem with revolutions is that you rarely see them coming. It's the out of nowhere, to quote Quran, right? Out of never, out of nowhere, you have a revolution. So I think those people who know things more than we do, maybe they know things more than we do. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't put hedge bets on it happening anytime soon.
I mean, I've been to Russia once and I'm sanctioned by Russia now, so I can't go there again. So I don't think I have very. So
clearly, revolution happening very soon. Is what
I have no valuable input on this. I don't think I know enough about Russia to.
We do have a colleague, she's now at Oxford, Katerina Tertichna, and then Tomila Lankina down at the LSE. They've been studying protests in Russia for a long time and tracking protests in Russia. And they've been also looking at the number of protests that have happened in Russia since the war. And, there is mobilization, even though this is a very repressive regime, and, the ones who we would think would be the leaders of the revolution are locked up, there is still, quite a bit of mobilization. But I would refer you to their work.
And Bryn Rosenfeld.
Bryn Rosenfeld, Mark Basinger, and others. We had the lady in the pink and turquoise sweater.
Hi, my name's Leslie Raymond. I'm just a member citizen who's passionately interested in what's happening in Ukraine and what it means for that whole part of Europe. And what I keep reading about is quite a few of the Western allies feel a bit let down. They feel the counter-offensive didn't really work and everything. But my recollection is that the major problem was the blowing up of the dam, which at the time that happened by the Russians was listed as an environmental disaster, wiping out agriculture, livestock, all the rest of it, but crucially was going to be the main route that the Ukrainians got into the part of, so that they could counterattack the Russians. So I wanted to know, first of all, what has happened now to that land and to that, and do you agree that that was one of the main stalling points in the counter-offensive? Because clearly the Russians had seen that was their weakest point. That was their back door into the east.
Emma, perhaps because you recently interviewed someone that is directly responsible for that side of the counteroffensive.
I mean, my understanding was that it wasn't the main issue. The main issue was that they were trying to get through this huge defensive line, which, you know, as General Tarnavsky explained in great detail, that he felt that Russia had put about sort of 60% of their effort into just building up this almost impenetrable initial defensive line that they actually never, he said from the way it was built and the military structures behind it, that they never expected the Ukrainians to get through. And the only way they got through it in the end was individual deminers going through and demining it by hand at night. But, you know, extraordinary courage, terrible losses. I mean, obviously Ukraine doesn't talk about them, but I think that there was some suggestion that they clearly were planning to do some stuff across the river, but I think that the difficulty of amphibious, I'm really not a military expert, so if anybody here is welcome to correct me, but it's just harder if you've got to cross water. It's easier to see you, it's easier to stop you, you've got to have a boat, you've got to land. So I think that was certainly part of the strategy, but I don't think that was the main thrust. I think the main issue was that Russia had a good year. You know, part of the criticism is that perhaps if the West had given some of the weapons it gave later at an earlier point, they might have had so long to build up such a sort of fortress defensive line along the south. That's my understanding.
Absolutely. I recently spoke to military experts exactly on this matter. Two things. ATACMS and aerial cover. Those are the things that the president, the Ukrainian army has been asking for quite some time. There's a very strategic reason why those particular types of military aid would be useful to the counteroffensive and what they could do precisely. The slow delivery in specifically these two things and the non-delivery yet of at least one, planes have not been delivered, really just means that they can't do certain types of things. The ATACMS are potentially a game changer. It's not clear, from what I understand, folks are divided on how much how much use of ATACMS can happen now in the fall to winter time. So as I understand, that is the main thing. The fact that in those months waiting for this, you build up it's not just one line, it's multiple lines, and it's up to 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers plus. That it's just very difficult to get that. The military experts here, military experts in Ukraine, nobody thought this was going to go any faster because they saw what was happening on the ground and they saw the kind of work that would have to take place. And without, again, certain types of aerial cover, you can't do certain things, right?
Western militaries would never have tried an offensive like that without air cover.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Ukrainians were trying to do something that, you know, the West was pushing Ukraine to get on faster with something that it wouldn't do. And personally, as someone who spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan, seeing people like Petraeus who presided over the sort of human and military catastrophe that was, you know, the Iraq, well, the periods of the war in Iraq, sort of being wheeled out as a pundit to talk about what Ukraine was doing wrong, I found that quite frustrating. I'm
jarring. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. But I don't think those people actually believed also that it's possible to go any faster. And so talking points and public discussions are not necessarily what people say behind closed doors. The other thing that I think was interesting, just 2 days ago, we had former President Viktor Yushchenko visit the University of Manchester. And one of the things he told us about the space around the Kakhovka Dam is that there is these former marshlands that were historically, I didn't know how much of a significant historical thing these marshlands were, but well, he does, and he told me all about them. But these marshlands have now been exposed, yeah? And you suddenly have types of vegetation growing that hasn't been growing for decades. There's a willow forest that popped up somewhere, 1.5 meter tall trees already. I don't understand it, but apparently. And in the places where you have some of the rivers, for the first time you're seeing the breeding of certain fish. And this is fascinating. And it's a little bit of a microcosm analogy for all of Russia's attempts to create destruction and try to win. Ukrainian nature in this case was like, no. We're going to, now there's a willow forest and all these wonderful things are happening in this marshland. specifically, that is not to take away from the human cost of what happened, the environmental cost of what happened. But who knew that there could be a willow forest in this space? Apparently that's what's happening now. Yeah.
All right, I think this is a wonderful place to end. Please join me in thanking our two speakers for their insights.